All right, I want to thank everybody for joining us at Maysles Documentary Center for this virtual cinema program, special sneak preview of Ella Fitzgerald's, the new documentary about Ella Fitzgerald. My name is Allison Lights. I'm the theater manager, currently virtual theater manager and programmer here at the cinema. Normally, we are screening documentaries year-round and in our cinema in Harlem, and also have education programs for youth in Harlem and the South Bronx. Obviously, right now, everything's virtual, but our education programs and our cinema, as you've seen, have also been able to be virtual during this time, which is great. We have today a very special sneak preview event in conjunction with the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, our neighbors at home. This screening, the film will be still available today until midnight Eastern time. That's June 19th, and then it will be in a regular theatrical run with Maysles Cinema from June 26th until mid-July sometime. So I hope that we have either caught you after watching it earlier today, or that you have watched it, or that you'll have a chance to watch it later on today or in the coming run. Today with me, I have some very amazing panelists. We've got Herb Boyd, who is a journalist and has spent 40 plus years with the Amsterdam News, the author of many books. He's our moderator for today's panel. We've got Camille Thurman, who's a saxophonist and educator and an all-around amazing musician. We've got Reggie Nadelson, who's the producer of Ella Fitzgerald and is also a writer and a journalist, and the founding director and senior scholar at the National Jazz Museum, saxophonist extraordinaire Loren Schoenberg. So I want to welcome you guys all here. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to pass along the baton to Herb now, and I hope you all enjoy.
Thank you, Allison. Wonderful. Happy Juneteenth, gang. I don't know if did you get that?
Yes, you do.
Very, very, very special day.
I mean, all over the country. It's picking up momentum, though, Camille, Loren, Reggie. You know, I think it's in 45 states now. And this is a remarkable thing. A lot of people don't understand what Juneteenth is all about. Maybe in our next program, we'll get into a lengthy explanation of that. But for the moment, you know, Ella, the first lady of song, the first lady of jazz, the first lady in my heart when it comes to understanding the songbook, the American songbook. Many of you had a chance to see the documentary, and perhaps, you know, Reggie, why don't we open up with you and give us a little background on how all of this came together?
Sure. Well, I've been in love with Ella all my life, and probably only you and I, Herb, remember Lewiston Stadium at City College uptown. And when I was a little kid, my father took me to an Ella Fitzgerald concert, and it was outdoors. It was a balmy New York night, and Ella was in a blue chiffon dress, and she was singing "Someone to Watch Over Me," and I was completely hooked, and that was it for the rest of my life. If I believed in God, I would think that Ella was evidence that there was a God. I mean, I've always adored her. And when it was going to be her 100th birthday in 2017, I thought, you know, there's never really been much of a documentary. And I have a very good friend who's a pretty distinguished British documentary filmmaker. And I called him and I said, let's do it. And then there was a question, of course, of raising the money and
some small items.
I know, when you say the D word,
right.
Documentary, people sort of run in the other direction, but we did. We got a company called Eagle Rock, who were wonderful. They gave us the whole budget, and we set about doing it. I mean, one of the sort of instrumental people is we had done a film with Tony Bennett many years ago, and I ran into him at a concert at the 92nd Street Y, and I went over, I said, Tony, if we can get this going, would you give us an interview? And he said, for Ella, anything. So that's how it came about.
How long did it take?
Well, from the time we started thinking about it, about 4 years, but once we had the money, Took about a year. The sad thing was, of course, by then, so many people had died only a few years earlier. I mean, so many of the great musicians, so many people, Oscar Peterson hadn't long been gone. But it was kind of fun because we had to find our way to people, and we found in Britain, we found a couple of wonderful young people, a wonderful young singer called Laura Mvula, and she was an Ella Nutt, and she was just incredible. So it kind of worked out. And of course, we got Smokey Robinson, the world's most handsome man. So. Except
certainly, it's a remarkable, I mean, in terms of her particular career, going all the way back to many of us here in Harlem, some of us here in Harlem may remember when she debuted at the Apollo Theater. I think, Loren, were you there?
I wish I had been there.
I want to sandwich you between Reggie and Camille, and just what is it? Any particular thing, scene, a moment, information that struck you from out of the documentary that you like to talk about?
Well, what I really loved about it was that it's well placed to take Ella, into the future, 2020 and going ahead 30, 40, 50 years. And, the old documentaries, many of which mention Ella and all this kind of stuff, they're all wonderful, but they were pitching to an audience that was born in the 30s or the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so, by virtue of the guests that they had and the way the conversation went, it's to make her eminently contemporary. And that really is what struck me. I mean, years ago I had worked on the Stuart Nicholson biography, which was just about the time that I did get to play One Night with Ella Fitzgerald, which we can talk about later. And I'm just fascinated by her story. So yeah, about the documentary, yes, absolutely. I thought it was spot on, and so well done. And I'll be sure to show it to my jazz history class.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad you felt that, because we really, it became a bonus in a way that we couldn't get to some of the surviving musicians, and a lot of them had passed. And so as a result, we went for younger people, including, as you know, a very, very younger person who's the end of the film, who's a 16-year-old who won the Ella contest at the Apollo. And that was amazing. I mean, out of nowhere, and Ella was her idol. And she even, when she said she was going to sing My Funny Valentine, she didn't say by Rodgers and Hart, she said by Ella Fitzgerald. And it was great to see young kids really getting it.
Yeah. Well, actually, I know we're going to Camille, but I'll just throw in this one anecdote just real quick, because I think it fits here. We were doing a program for the National Jazz Museum in Harlem 10 years ago or so out in Queens. And this particular school, this particular neighborhood had a lot of Asian students. And not only a lot of Asian students, but a lot of children who had come over recently, who had not been in the States a long time. And there were a lot of, I guess, English as a second language things going on. So they told me that we went in, that, the way that we were going to present the story, we should really speak kind of clearly and plainly and all this. Well, we go in, and this is back when John Batiste had first started with us at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, so he was still at Juilliard in those days. He was playing the piano. And we're doing the program, and I asked them all to sing along, and some sang, some didn't. And then we had a question and answer. And this little girl in the back raised her hand, and she asked something about Miss Ella, is how she said it, Miss Ella, whatever. And I saw the teacher next to me crying. All of a sudden, she just kind of, she wasn't sobbing, but she was crying. And when it was done, I went up to her and I said, what was it that happened at that moment? I was totally unaware. It was just a question. She said that girl had been quiet all year and hadn't said one word in English. And when we played the Ella Fitzgerald record and went around for questions, all of a sudden, and it turns out, we found out later, that her parents, who had just come over to the States, their favorite singer in the world was Ella Fitzgerald. And this was the first time that this little girl, and she couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, had heard something in the whole curriculum of the school that in any way related to what she heard at home. And I thought that, Huh?
From?
She's from China, and a recent immigrant. And so I just thought that really spoke like to Ella's magic as it worked. But I also know, that it also reaches younger folks, a much younger generation, like Camille. And Herb, are you still there? I think Herb's out. So at this point, I'll just pass it over and say, would love to hear from Camille about what you thought about the film, and also just how someone from your generation came to all of this.
Sure. Well, for me, I've been always an Ella Fitzgerald fanatic. I used to sing her records when I was 13, 14 years old with my hairbrush and my mirror, mimicking her scatting and all her singing, and eventually learning all her solos and scatting them too. The thing that struck me about this documentary is that I loved how there were a couple of points that were spoken. The point that she ran away from home at such a young age, and that
Mm-hmm.
she ended up at a wayward home, and how this music, she didn't plan on singing. She was going to dance, but the singing ended up being an opportunity that just completely changed her life. And I love that it spoke on the fact that this young woman, she came from a family situation that wasn't perfect and ideal, which a lot of cases for artists, our refuge is the music itself. And she was able to use this art to influence and inspire so many people and so many generations. And I just love that that was made clear in the beginning, because a lot of times, sometimes people see the artist and they see the makeup and they see the beautiful dresses and they see the wonderful concerts, but they don't get to really personally understand the person behind the music and how that was important in shaping what they did. So I love that part. And I also love the part that you did put in there talking about how she was, I believe she was in her early part of the career, and how she got stuck in the elevator. I didn't even know this story, and how people were body shaming her.
Oh,
And
yeah.
you think about it, and it's like, wow, this same crap happens today. And it's a perspective on a woman and an artist that I would have never known if had I not watched that documentary. And it still happens today. It's an issue that many women artists deal with, being critiqued by your physicality, and that being placed in front of the artistry. So I thought it was very interesting to hear that story and to open a dialogue today in the modern music scene. How do we deal with how we project artists versus society, and how they see a vocalist or see an instrumentalist that's a woman? So yes.
I'm so glad, because I had a wonderful interview with one of my favorite writers, Margo Jefferson, who was the cultural critic at the Times and won a Pulitzer Prize and wrote Teaches at Columbia. And I had a long interview with Margo about, body images, and her saying if you didn't look like Lena Horne, you didn't have a chance. It was much worse then than it is now, and how, Ella could have been a librarian when she was growing up, and had, there were so many issues going on, and it was so hard for her. And I just thought that was really, really interesting stuff. You could have done 60 minutes on that, but Margot's terrific at talking about clothes and hair and skin color, but there was no room for all of that. But it's really interesting stuff.
Camille, is there one particular song that she recorded or that you heard that lives with you, that resonates with you?
Oh man. So many. I remember I had an opportunity to honor her at a centennial, Ella Fitzgerald centennial, with the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra. I believe it was 2 years
I saw you
ago.
there.
Oh,
Me too.
oh gosh. And when they approached me, they asked, could you do Lady Be Good? And it's funny because I had all these memories as a young child singing along to Ella Fitzgerald's music and learning her solos, and then also watching the videos. And then I admired her just as a young artist because she was somebody that I can identify with. She looks like me, my complexion. She was an artist. She carried herself with such grace, and when I looked at her, she looked like somebody regal, and I don't want to say idolized, but yeah, I kind of idolized her. So to turn around 100 years later and honor her, like Lady Be Good, and quoting some of her solo and then being able to take it and make it my own was such an honor.
No,
Oh,
you were
yes.
great. That was fabulous.
Thank you.
All right, Loren, give me yours.
Well, I mean, I'll name five. The songbook albums, obviously. The duo she did, the duo she did with Ellis Larkins back in 1950 and 51, and those are really groundbreaking. And so many times I talk about Frank Sinatra, who, and by the way, I guess you've seen those films, that one session of Sinatra and Ella, where at some point, I mean, here's Frank Sinatra, who's, in charge of the world, kind of in his mind. And when she gets up to sing, he sits down on the stage, knowing the camera's on him, he sits on the floor, draws up his knees like a school kid looking at the thing. Those albums she did with Ellis Larkins, like in 1950 and 51, where she does Ella Loves Gershwin, and all those songs that they usually credit with Sinatra, that he brought those back because they weren't famous songs at the time. They were old songs. And now they're also classic, and so I love those records. And then I love the late duets with Joe Pass when she was already, when she didn't sing like she did when she was young. And she brings something to it that's just as great, if not deeper, because she's an older woman, and maybe with some of the perfection, I hate to say the perfection gone, but some of the range gone, she has to do other things, almost like the late Lena Horne got a little more interesting as she got older. But I love that. And then the other one I love is there is a TV clip from the 1950s. Well, there's the one with Nat Cole, of course, where they do Dancing on the Ceiling. But the other one is she does a song called There's a Lull in My Life. Lull in My Life, yeah. And I have a funny story about that for some other time, because lull is actually a dirty word in Dutch. And they had to, and it's the word for you-know-what. And they had to take, and they couldn't play the record in the Netherlands because There's a Lull in My Life was like a strange thing. But anyway, there's a TV version from the 50s of her singing that song. And I don't know what it is, but she's so warm and so real and so wonderful. Those are just some of my favorites. Yeah,
it's a wonderful. I hear you, Loren. What about Reggie? In doing the documentary, I have to see it again in order to pay a little bit closer attention. But I don't know if we talked about Ella Fitzgerald as a composer. Did that come off at all?
Well, I think the only thing we talked about was her writing A Tisket, a Tasket, which is the thing she did. And I don't know how many people even know that, but of course it made her a huge star. It went right to the top of the charts and kind of put her, and then she does it in a silly Abbott and Costello movie. And that's what a lot of people know about her. I just wanted to say the one thing about Sinatra was he so idolized her that he always insisted she have his dressing room whenever they did a show. And one of the saddest things is they never made an album together, and that was partly due to, wonderful as he was for many reasons, Norman Granz, who was, I don't know if everybody knows, but Norman Granz was, apart from being Ella's manager, he ran jazz at the Philharmonic and did a lot of other important things for jazz. But he tried to tell Sinatra what order to sing in. And Sinatra did not like being told anything. And after that, he absolutely would have nothing to do with Granz. So it's a pity because they should have made a lot of albums together.
Well, there's that TV show, thank God.
Thank God. There are a lot of TV shows. One of the clips I found, which we couldn't use, was her and Bing singing a very swinging version of London Bridge is Falling Down. Kind of wonderful.
Was there ever a recording of her singing at Chick Webb's funeral? My Buddy. Was ever recorded at all?
No, sadly not. I mean,
Yeah,
some of the
yeah.
things that you would kill to have. There's no film of her and Louis.
Whoa, that's true. That's right. But you've collected, images and clips and snippets of film from all over the place. I mean, it's amazing that putting together a documentary, you can gather up all the pieces, but now you got to put the puzzle together. And thematically, you got to lay out a theme, and you have to have an objective. Do you feel you satisfied everything you wanted to do with the documentary, Reggie?
No, you never can. I mean, and that's really not me. That's Leslie Woodhead, who's a brilliant director, but he's also brilliant in the editing room and can think up things like the section where he has Will Friedwald talking about how high the moon and chops it into pieces so you can hear what he says and see what she's doing. I mean, Will was a great resource. If anybody's interested in jazz singing especially, his books are amazing.
What is it, 40 songs she does in there?
40.
Yeah, 40.
40 songs. That's amazing. Loren, can you do that?
No.
That's amazing. I imagine Camille, you can do it, right, Camille?
I mean, Ella was ingenious to think of that off the fly and insert all those tunes and make a perfect solo.
Whoa.
That's a
And
genius.
the thing that amazes me, she had no training. She didn't sing in church. I mean, she didn't have an Aretha kind of background. She wanted to dance, and she gets up at the Apollo, and they say, do something. And she opens her mouth, and she's Ella Fitzgerald. Luckily, we had Miss Norma Miller, who had been there that night, who was this extraordinary woman who was a great Lindy Hopper. And Miss Norma was incredible. She said, we booed because we were kids. We didn't know who this was. We booed, and then she sang, and she said she shut us up so fast you could hear a rat piss on cotton.
She lived here in Harlem on 1 block from me on 145th Street.
At the Woodside.
Exactly. You talk something about her musical background. Did she like Ma Rainey, Lauren, Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday? I mean, you don't talk about anybody going to any kind of a music school or academy to be taught music.
Well, I'll just say just real quickly, and then growing up at that time, a lot of what we do, a lot of what they teach in music school and jazz schools, I think you had coming in your window. So you heard Louis Armstrong, you heard these records. It was, people breathed it. But actually, the only main inspiration that A, you can hear, and B, that she acknowledged was Connie Boswell.
Yeah.
Of the Boswell sisters. And, right. So when you hear her, her and Billie Holiday are almost contemporaries. And, Ella has, on the one hand, the quote-unquote typical sound of a young singer singing in a more traditional kind of fashion, in a way, not talking about her time, talking about her phrasing, talking about her musicality, just the sound of the voice. And in fact, she sounded like a young girl till the day she died. I mean, she had that. In fact, a mutual friend of ours will say that she sounds like a young boy almost. And then Billie Holiday, obviously sounding like 180 degrees different, just sounding so different. And the fact that they both came up at the same time and, within blocks of each other, Pod and Jerry's and all those places was on 132nd Street, and Ella is around, just highlights her great individuality. But I'll tell you something, I think the thing that knocked everybody out from the very beginning was her musicianship. And this gets to I'd like later on when we get to that point, tell the story about the one evening I did spend in Benny Carter's band backing her and how she how she came off. But I'll just put my toe in that water by saying that musicians, all musicians look at Ella like they look at Lester Young or Coleman Hawkins or Duke Ellington or John Coltrane or whatever. She's that level of musician. She happens to be a singer.
That's why we went to Itzhak Perlman, who we were very lucky to get. And I thought, well, let's give it a try. What can we lose? Because I think he had hosted her last gala, or maybe even after she had passed. And he and his wife run a music school on one of those islands, Shelter Island, or one of those places. And he says he always plays Ella for the kids. And he said she could turn a phrase. He said his music teacher said, well, you can teach anything. And he said, no, you can't teach magic. And that's what Ella had.
That's a great line.
Great line.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
And also, we got to remember too, the radio was the education back in that day. There was so much music happening. Today, it's a little different because the music has kind of been institutionalized through the schools. But back in the day, the school was where you lived, on the streets. And a lot of those great musicians, there was a relationship, there was a rapport. They were in the scene together. They were working those places. They were playing the music all the time. The fact that she got together with Dizzy at the time when bebop was being born was incredibly instrumental in her being able to develop her skill and her vocabulary as a scat singer. And when you think about it, the fact that she was on the road with them, I think the document said for like two years or something like that, or two tours. Yeah. You think about it, like for me as a musician, I'm like, man, that must be an incredible educational experience to be on 2 tours with Dizzy Gillespie, knowing you're learning all this harmony, you're learning all this rhythm, and then when you hear Ella, it just comes out like an instrument naturally because she was immersed in that world and she was an instrumental. She was an instrumentalist through her voice.
It's so interesting to hear that because I'm not a music. I mean, my tragedy is I love music more than anything. I can't carry the tune. I mean, when I sing in the car, I sound like Ella, but nobody else thinks so. But one of the things that Kenny Barron, whom we were lucky to get, one of my favorite pianists, that Ella had great ears.
Yes.
And you were absolutely right. They settled in Yonkers, and they were poor, but her mother worked, and they had a radio at home. And so she would have been hearing Duke Ellington and Louis and Benny Goodman, but she also, the thing that interested me is that's when the Great American Songbook songs were being written. Rodgers and Hart, Cole Porter, Gershwin all had shows on Broadway.
Oh, yes.
So their tunes would have been on the radio, and she was. I think Margo Jefferson said she was coming into Harlem at a time when everything was happening: jazz, blues, what would become the Great American Songbook. But I always thought, and maybe you can answer this, that one of the differences between Ella and Billie, Ella basically is a Northerner. She came here when she was 2, and she has a Northern voice. She doesn't have a Southern voice. She has a very, Connie Boswell kind of voice initially anyway. So she did a lot of what she heard. Although she was in love with Snake Hips, I've forgotten his last name, her dance.
Tucker.
Tucker. Anyway, how wonderful that she didn't dance.
Well, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Loren.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to talk about Ethel Waters for a moment because, Ethel Waters would have been a role model in a way for Ella and Billie and all those folks. And that early on, even before Louis Armstrong made records, Ethel Waters is singing and she is conversant in many different dialects or many different ways of sounding, rolling her R's and, all that kind of stuff. And then she could also record with a gospel quartet like she did in 1926. And I just think that, that she was a huge influence in the sense of you can sound any number of ways. But I'll tell you something about Ella that Ella and Billie have in common, which is superb diction. Yeah. So interesting. Yeah.
Ella and Chick Webb beat out Stacy and Billie in one of those band competitions at the Savoy Ballroom. Because Ella apparently had, when she got up, people just roared. I mean, she had even very early, she's teenager, and she got up to sing, and people
You're
just
fading out.
Yeah, I just wanted to also.
Reggie. Hmm.
I'm sorry, Reggie. You were kind of fading out there. I think
You
Herb was
faded
saying.
out.
sit okay
Yes.
now.
Yeah. Yep.
Thanks.
Let me ask you this here, because one of the amusing moments in the documentary is Ray Brown Jr.
Mm.
and his attempts to do "Where Have I've Been All These Years." I mean, you got to struggle with that one, didn't you, Loren?
It was great to see him. He's a
Oh
name to
yeah,
me. I know that he existed, but this is the first time I've really heard him.
me too. Hmm.
I have to
Yeah.
tell you, that was my great success tracking him down. He lives in Ukraine, in the Russian part of Ukraine, and he um, fell out with his wife because he was having something to do with a lady on a cruise ship. He plays on cruise ships, and I don't know how it happened, but then he married the lady on the cruise ship who's Ukrainian, and
Oh my goodness.
I mean, and we thought, how are we going? So we thought, let's get him to London instead of trying to take a film crew there. Getting someone from where he lives, it's like 10 trains and a plane, but he was wonderful. And him singing is kind of my fault because I was doing the interview and I said, which is your favorite song of your mother's? And he told me, and I said, well, do a couple of bars, Ray. And he said, no, I don't want to. And I said, come on, I bought you all that good whiskey and all those Cuban cigars. Do a few bars. And of course, everybody was in tears because it was his mother. And it was fabulous to get him. It was really an amazing thing to see.
Camille, is there any preference that you have in terms of her up tempo as opposed to ballads? Any preference?
Oh man. I mean, of
She
course,
was.
how High the Moon, which we already said, was just a jaw dropper for me because to sit and watch somebody for 5 minutes straight and scat,
Mm.
and then to just have the ideas endless and endless, and it's peak and peak and peak and peak and peak, chorus after chorus after chorus. It's just a masterclass in how to solo 101.
Shoot,
But
shoot.
I would say that was one of my favorites of her up
Mhm.
tempos. And then, of course, being a student, watching all her videos online and seeing how she interacted with the band, you could just see the sweat just coming down. She was like the consummate
Mm.
performer. If you wanted to understand how to perform, watch Ella Fitzgerald. Seeing her interact with the band, whether it's an up-tempo song or even a ballad. I'll never forget she did Misty. Oh man,
No.
that pulled my heartstrings because the way she would just interpret a melody, and then she had this spin with her voice that she would do with the vibrato. It just she's one of my favorites. But there's so many songs.
I know
Even
it's impossible to choose every
it's
time somebody says, what's your
impossible.
favorite
I
song?
mean,
I mean, I have
Yeah.
favorites that are nobody mentions, like Lorelei, which is on the album in Berlin, which I think is the side of her that's
Great album too.
cute and
Yeah.
charming and witty.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah. I remember when I first heard her sing Mr. Paganini in German. I was like, wait, that's Ella? And my uncle was like, yeah, she's singing. And I was just like, man, I don't know any other amazing jazz artists that could scat like that and sing in another language flawlessly.
There's that great clip of her with Paul Gonzalez, I guess, with the
Mm,
Ellington band where they're doing Cottontail, right? You know that one, of
yeah.
course. We saw it, and Paul's hauling out. I mean, real interval saxophonistic stuff, and she just goes with it. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
wonderful clip that we took forever to find. I mean, I'm sure you've probably seen it, Lauren, but I could send it to all of you, which was her first TV performance. And it was Ella doing Someone to Watch Over Me on a show hosted by Cab Calloway. And it's one of those fake sets. She's like alone in a room. She's reading love magazines and in a rocking chair. And it was at the Museum of African American History. And you've probably seen it, Lauren.
Actually, I've not seen that one.
Well, I'd be happy to send it all to you since I'm sure it's not allowed. So it's an amazing thing.
You just I'm sorry, Camille, please.
No, it's okay. No, I was gonna say even the obscure tunes like Miss Otis Regrets.
Oh,
The subject matter, when you think about it, is really dark, but her delivery, and it was just profound because it's just like she could take something as tragic as this and still make it beautiful.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, I was just going to say that that clip of her and Nat Cole from the Nat Cole show. She's not acting. I mean, when I say she's not acting, like when she's holding hands with Nat and the way she looks, I mean, she wasn't like that kind of singer entertainer, like, wow, she wasn't like that. It's really her that you see all the time. And I, especially in in the Nat Cole clip, sometimes I just feel like I know her. And I heard a wonderful anecdote from a friend of hers who said that Norman Granz was like Mr. High Society, and he knew Pablo Picasso, and he fine wines and all this. And he said, Ella would, she was really at home in her home out in Beverly Hills. She'd rather spend the night at home, sitting in the kitchen with her cook, actually, who was her friend. And she preferred that to like going out to the nightlife and the high life. She'd go out when she had to. Of course, if Marilyn Monroe was sitting there in the front row, I'm sure she was thrilled to support her. But that she really was a home buddy, and not the glamorous type. And I wonder if that's what appealed to people about her.
Certainly would appeal to her. I mean, in terms of her getting that home that Norman had to, I guess, sign for that particular property because she couldn't get into that neighborhood.
That's right.
The whole racism that she had to encounter.
Yeah.
But I think, what about her Reggie, what about her participation, her connection to the civil and human rights struggle in this country?
Well, that was another one of those great finds in the Paley Museum at the bottom of a box. I mean, I think Ella, like a lot of performers of her generation, a lot of them didn't feel comfortable speaking out, and a lot of people got accused of calming. I mean, like Louis Armstrong, people often said really stupid things about. But there in this box was an interview done by a DJ. His name was Fred Robbins, and suddenly she just said, "Can I say something?" And he said, "Well, of course." And she said, "I'm so embarrassed. We traveled to Europe and people said, you just lay down south." This was in '63 at the very height of the, awful stuff going on. And she said, "And I'm so embarrassed and I don't understand why we can't play everywhere. It's music. Why can't we all love each other?" And then she says, those diehards down there die hard. And that was such a revelation, because Ella was always very polite, very reserved, never talked about her miserable childhood. And suddenly there it was, and the interview was never broadcast. And the only other person we could get to talk about it was Tony Bennett, who's always been a very active civil rights participant. Ella said to me, Tony, we're all just here. But I think she did a lot more than she ever talked about than people.
Exactly. You had that feeling.
Yeah.
Because some of the...
That was true of people like Nat Cole, too, when he moved into his fancy neighborhood.
Exactly.
No, and in L.A., they burned a cross on his lawn and killed his dog. It was awful times. And we're not talking the 30s. We're talking 50s, 60s, even 70s. Smokey Robinson talked about, about how when Dorothy Dandridge stayed at a hotel somewhere, this in Las Vegas, she went for a swim and they drained the pool. Stunning.
I was wondering how, in terms of this new generation, I think your documentary will help a lot in introducing her to a whole fresh generation of listeners who may not have caught her in her peak years. For me, her favorite period would be when she's with Tommy Flanagan. Ellis Larkin's fine.
Ooh.
I take Tommy Flanagan, but then the interpretive skills that she brought to it, particularly, well, Loren, we won't get into that,
No, 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 no.
but,
Just kidding.
either way, any way you can take Ella, whatever the pianist, and of course Ellis and Tommy Flanagan and a few others who could complement. And Camille, you were talking about this ability to weave all these songs together. I was always curious to know, well, harmonically, how correct was that?
Spot on. Spot on. I mean, you got to think about it. Improvisation, that's a muscle in itself, being able to take what you have and fit it into situation at that moment, at that time, because the music is moving. So for her to do that with Phil and to interject those little pieces of melodies and create this beautiful story, it's artful. It's really ingenious.
Mm-hmm. There used to be a part, though, Loren, of the jazz musicians, particularly out of the 30s and the 40s, maybe more so in the 40s, that they would have snippets of the American songbook interpolated in their solos. I know the jazz musicians out of the bebop period, they had a lot of them, and sometimes, almost signature clips that they would have.
No, it's true. It's true, and, it goes back to Louis Armstrong, and his interpolations of Rhapsody in Blue and his interpolations of Puccini and classical things. It's always been a big part, I guess you could call almost signifying, of a way of making a statement about something. And they're multi-leveled. And I know that, I'm 61, but I know that even in my generation, we play a lot of quotes because Clifford Brown played the quote or Sonny Rollins played the quote. A lot of times we didn't know what we were quoting. We were quoting them, but we didn't know that there's a song called All This in Heaven Too, where there's all these da 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 da. Right. And so someone like Ella is operating on so many levels. Sometimes people would say, well, she sounds Pollyannish. Or, we don't get from her what we get from Billy. Well, that's true. And you don't get from Billy what you get from Ella. And that Ella, just to look at her as a statement, as a woman, and I want to go back to what Camille talked about back at the earliest thing, when we first started talking about, to this day, and this is a whole other avenue, and we can get off of it for a moment, but to this day, female saxophonists, especially if they play the alto, have to have an album cover that looks like a cocktail waitress or something, or with the fishnet stockings and all this kind of stuff. And it's for all the other battles that go on in our culture and in our world, the gender and the way the objectification. And there is a generation. It's Camille's generation, and some of her peers, who are just the most eloquent refutation of all those stereotypes. But it's amazing how things really haven't changed, or have very, very little changed. And I imagine that. Well, I'm talking about something that I'm not living, because that's not me. But I'm curious, like with Camille, because we were saying like that things have changed, and Ella becomes all the more important.
She does, and things have obviously changed somewhat. They haven't changed that much for girls or women. You think they have, but we don't all look like Beyonce.
Well, not only that, but I wonder how Camille feels, because the jazz world still remains 90% male, right? The audience, it seems, maybe I'm wrong, and the musicians, and there's still a tremendous amount of well, anyway, I'd rather hear from Camille about this. I'm talking about it.
We still have a lot of work to do. Even just getting women to be interested in the music and to continue studying it, so that they can get to the point where if they want to pursue it professionally, they have the support. That's really critical. And then also, I do a lot of talks with educators and with students. It's critical for students, especially young women, to see examples. Like I said in the beginning, for me, seeing Ella Fitzgerald, seeing Vi Red, seeing Sarah Vaughan, they all were darker complexion women in the music that were amazing. And they looked regal. They carried themselves in a way where, okay, yes, they were feminine, but they were beautiful and they weren't objectified because of their body. And most importantly, their talent was on display. That was just incredible. And that for me became an example for me to strive towards for developing my own artistry. So I believe part of the solution is getting more examples out there available for people to know, young and old, to see. Many times, like I tour with the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra for the last 2 years, and many times women would come up to me or people would come up to me, where are the rest of them? Why are you the only one? I'm like, well, hold up, wait a minute. Where are you getting information from? Because there's a lot of phenomenal women out there, but it's a matter of giving a platform to be seen and to be heard and for it to be consistent. The only way I knew about Ella Fitzgerald was because of my mother. She brought me the albums. I got to look at them. I got to read the discography. I got to watch the documentaries. I got to see her and so many other strong women role models that were artists also. So we have to do our job as society in making sure that we're providing opportunities for people to be seen and to be heard so that there's diversity. And so if that's a choice where an artist chooses to focus more on their physicality of being a woman or whatever, that's totally fine. But then also let's put some examples that are the other end of the spectrum, like a Ella Fitzgerald, like a Nina Simone, like a Billie Holiday and whatnot, because their voices need to be heard and seen too, for the possibility.
I just reviewed for Downbeat. I review music there, among other things. But I just did Alexa Tarantino. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's just a fine saxophonist. Tia Fuller. You know, some of the women who have done breakthrough albums, you know, and showing their proficiency on horns. You know, you can go, as at least a half a dozen of them that I have reviewed over the last several months, and just amazing. So I see you in that particular tradition and that kind of progression, Camille. I'm looking forward to hearing your album. You got one out there?
I put out one last year, Waiting for the Sunrise, but we're working on another one right now.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So, Loren, what kind of projects do you have going at this point?
Me, the National Jazz Museum in Harlem remains my focus, as it has for quite some time, and so I'm very busy doing online educational things with them, and got my saxophones out of the dustbin over there, and I've been trying to blow the smoke out of them, and just
kind of with you and Camille. I need to hear that.
Okay. But I just wanted to mention, I'm not sure how much more time we have, but I just wanted to get to that story of that one night that I did get to see Ella Fitzgerald in action. And I don't know, we had a photo of it there, Alison. I don't know whether you can put it up or not, but basically when Benny Carter used to come to New York, put together a big band at his direction. We did many gigs over the years. Well, one was a Norman Granz thing at Radio City Music Hall, and we backed Ella Fitzgerald. Now, you know, Benny Carter played a huge role, as we know, in the discovery of Ella Fitzgerald. He took her to Fletcher Henderson, he took her to Chick Webb, and he did all these things for her early on. And she came, and we went to rehearse. And I'll just make it a very short story, but the point, that's backstage at the concert. That's Eddie Burt, the trombonist, and Ella, and that's me about pounds ago. And there we are with Ella. Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Beautiful.
But the point of the story is this. We're on the stage, we're rehearsing, and word comes out that Ella's coming down to rehearse her set. Now, I've worked with like I'm sure Camille has. I've worked on many shows with many singers and many stars. I mean, like that kind of thing. And usually it's the big hubbub that so-and-so's coming and all their people come out and they come out and they waste a lot of time. And it's just a big drag many times. Ella Fitzgerald came out by herself with one guy named Val Valentine, who worked for Norman Granz, who had been a recording engineer and was kind of a all-around guy. He came out with Ella. Ella came out, sat on a stool in front of the band, and ran down her charts, just like, I don't know if Dizzy had been there or if Tommy Flanagan, but just like a musician would. Ran down her things, no big show, no big nothing, very humble, quiet, ran down her stuff and went off. And then, came out to Radio City Blanken Music Hall that night to do the show. And I will tell you something, to feel the love of I don't know how many thousands of people. I mean, it was tangible when she sang. And I remember someone some reviewer, some stupid reviewer, wrote a review, not of that concert, but of something, right? This was of the early 90s, I guess, about how, well, her voice isn't what, and maybe she should, we don't, and someone said something, you want to know something? I would rather hear her read the phone book than hear 9 out of 10 singers sing. She could sing the phone book, and it wouldn't make a difference. And that's my closing shot. But I'll just say that I'm kind of blending where Camille took us with this and where you took us and with Reggie's film. I think this film is just perfectly placed right now because all the action items that Camille was touching on, this is a great place to start this documentary because it pushes off for the next 100 years. And I'm just glad to be part of this. Well, yeah.
It's exciting to hear because at a certain point I thought, I didn't know that much about her personal life or any of this, and kind of told some of the funders that she was this, that I kind of said things I didn't really know. I mean, I promised them secrets and stuff nobody knew about Ella, and then researching it and going to the Smithsonian and going all over the place, it was true. I mean, she wasn't only a great singer. I mean, she was kind of a feminist. She was leading her own band when Chick Webb died. She took over the band. I mean, she was 19 years old and she had these, 10 or 12 or 14 crazy guys who, smoked dope on the bus. And she, of course, never did anything. And, then she goes over to Minton's having done swing and sings novelty songs. And she goes to Minton's. We shot a lot of the film at Minton's. And she's singing with Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, and it just blew my mind the level of various life that she had. But I was especially interested in the feminist stuff, some of her civil rights stuff that nobody ever thought. They thought Ella was a nice middle-aged lady with a sort of polite manner. People used to say, well, she has a pretty voice, but she doesn't really get the lyrics. And I'm thinking, if you don't get the lyrics, you can't sing Cole Porter. I mean, crazy stuff. And somebody said to me, Billy, and they were very different, but Billy wore her heart on her sleeve, and Ella turned all her misery into joy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Rosa Parks was just this little old quiet singstress, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Wait, I think you dispelled a number of concerns and also reinvigorated, I think, and put her life in a perspective that we got to appreciate. I was just curious to see whether it would ever be shown at the Apollo, so it can come. Ella's life could be brought full circle. Is that in there?
Well, when it was going to be in real theaters, we started to talk to the Apollo about maybe doing a big opening. We're doing it for the benefit of the Apollo. One of the things that slightly got in the way, the Apollo was making its own film about the Apollo. And I think they thought that might, but in the end, we were going to do something with it, but then all of this stuff happened and it became difficult, but who knows? I'd like to do a feature film. Camille could play the young Ella. maybe Queen Latifah could play the older Ella. Always
You
said,
got.
my mother said, "Why have economy and fantasy?" But I think
Well,
one of the things I just wanted to say very quickly, and
sure.
maybe my fantasy as a born and bred and dyed-in-the-wool New Yorker, I always thought Ella would have been personally happy not to be stranded in Beverly Hills. I mean, she lived in Addisley Park in Queens, and on her block, I mean, wouldn't you like, is that where you live?
That's where I'm from.
Oh my God.
Oh,
On her block were Count Basie, Lena Horne, Illinois Jackhead, and Jackie Robinson. Don't you want to be at that picnic?
Yeah.
And I thought, you know, in New York, she had roots, she had people you could walk out. I always thought, because she was very lonely in the last half of her life, and I thought, Beverly Hills is such an ungodly place anyway. Anyway, that's just my fantasy that New York is better.
Well, one of your fantasies, one of your dreams have been realized and made manifest for hundreds of thousands of people, I hope. And it gets other platforms, and folks get an opportunity to look into the life of Ella Fitzgerald through your lens. And I think you have also inspired them to even go further, you know, to get those songbooks, you know, that's where she lived. The Gershwin, the Cole Porter, you know, even, I mean, I thought the Gershwin stuff was superb. The Cole Porter, boom. Did she do Irving Berlin?
Did Irving Berlin, the
Irving
Duke
Berlin.
Ellington.
great,
Duke
the Second
Ellington, yeah.
Doll and Lush Life are great. She did Rogers and Hart. I mean, my
Oh,
favorite
well, Rogers and Hart is superb.
songs is
That may be the epitome right there.
you know.
Well, I think this is a great moment, and Camille and Reggie, and of course my good partner Loren. It's been a good moment to be with you here on my rooftop in Harlem, talking about the First Lady of Song, and she's also, I think, the last lady of song.
Thanks, Herb.
Thanks, Herb.
Okay, gang,
Thank you all.
it's a pleasure.
Take care.
Okay.
Here's
Bye-bye.
let's have a drink.
Bye bye.
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 Bye, everybody.
Bye.